For years, Sumit and Jenny's relationship has been one of the most emotionally charged stories in the entire 90-Day Fiancé universe. What began as a secret online romance slowly unraveled into a complicated web of family pressure, cultural conflict, and personal sacrifice that played out in front of millions. Viewers watched Jenny leave everything behind to build a life in India, believing that love would be enough to overcome tradition, resistance, and time. But behind the scenes, the story unfolding was far more complex than what cameras ever fully captured. Because while the show framed their struggle as a clash between love and family expectations, those closest to the situation say something much deeper was brewing, something that would eventually push Sumit to a breaking point he could no longer ignore. Tonight, we are not here to sensationalize or accuse. We are here to examine a turning point, a moment when private pain reportedly crossed into public consequences. According to multiple sources familiar with the situation, Sumit is now considering or has already initiated legal steps following what have been described as explosive allegations made by Jenny regarding her treatment within his family home. These allegations do not come from tabloids or fan speculation alone. They stem from patterns viewers have watched unfold for years. Repeated claims of mistreatment, emotional isolation, and power dynamics that left Jenny feeling trapped rather than welcomed. And now those claims are no longer just part of a reality TV storyline. They may be entering a legal arena. To understand why this matters, we need to slow down and rewind. Because this is not about one argument, one episode, or one emotional outburst. This is about a long timeline of unresolved conflict. One where cameras often cut away at the most critical moments. Jenny has repeatedly described feeling less like a family member and more like an obligation. Words like controlled, ignored, and used have surfaced in interviews how Sumit and Jenny's relationship reached this breaking point confessionals, and off-camera statements over the years. While the show often framed these moments as cultural misunderstanding, insiders suggest the reality may have been far more severe than what viewers were shown. What changed recently is not just the intensity of Jenny's claims, but their specificity. Allegations reportedly shifted from emotional hardship to detailed accounts of daily treatment that Jenny says crossed a line. These are not claims we are presenting as fact. They are allegations that Sumit himself is now said to be responding to in a way he never has before through legal counsel rather than silence. And that alone signals something significant because throughout the entire history of this relationship, Sumit's pattern has been avoidance, mediation, and delay. Legal action represents a complete break from that pattern. Sources say Sumit believes the narrative surrounding his family, particularly his mother, has escalated beyond what can be dismissed as reality TV editing or emotional exaggeration. He is reportedly concerned not just about reputation but about long-term consequences. In India, allegations involving domestic treatment, coercion, or servitude carry serious legal and social weight even when they are disputed. And once such claims enter public discourse, they can no longer be controlled by editing or production decisions. This is where the story takes a turn. Because while many assumed Jenny was finally speaking out after years of silence, few expected Sumit to respond with potential legal action. That response reframes everything. It suggests that whatever was said behind closed doors has now reached a point where it threatens more than relationships. It threatens legacies, family standing, and legal exposure. And when that happens, the rules of reality television no longer apply. To understand how this situation reached a legal crossroads, we have to look closely at the moments viewers often brushed off as if family drama. Because when those moments are placed side by side, a troubling pattern begins to form from the earliest days of Jenny living in India. Sumit's family made it clear that her presence was conditional. She was not welcomed as a daughter-in-law. She was tolerated, and even that tolerance came with rules, surveillance, and unspoken expectations. Cameras captured tension at dinner tables, passive-aggressive remarks, and constant reminders that Jenny did not belong. But what cameras didn't always capture was the day-to-day reality of living inside that environment. Jenny has repeatedly stated that she felt isolated inside Sumit's family home. She described being excluded from conversations, ignored during family decisions, and treated as someone who needed to earn her place. At the time, many viewers interpreted this as a cultural clash, an older generation struggling to accept an unconventional relationship. TLC often reinforced that framing, softening moments with music, narration, and quick cuts. But insiders say the emotional impact on Jenny was far heavier than what aired. According to people close to the production, there were long stretches where Jenny was visibly distressed off camera, struggling with feelings of invisibility and control. One of the most telling signs came when Jenny began using language that went beyond emotional hurt. In later interviews and private conversations, She reportedly described her role in the household as servant-like. She spoke about being expected to clean, cook, and remain silent while decisions about her life were made around her. Again, these are allegations, not established facts. But what matters is how consistently they appear over time. When a single complaint repeats across seasons, formats, and contexts, it stops being a moment and starts becoming a narrative. What complicates this further is Sumit's position in the middle. On camera, he often appeared torn, pleading with his parents while trying to comfort Jenny. But off camera, sources say his indecision played a role in allowing tensions to escalate. By refusing to fully confront either side, Sumit may have unintentionally enabled a dynamic where Jenny felt powerless and unheard. And while viewers often criticized him for being passive, few realized how serious the situation was becoming behind the scenes. Because what looked like simple hesitation on television was, according to people close to the situation, something far more complicated in real life. It was not just indecision, it was pressure building from every direction at once. Family expectations, cultural boundaries, personal loyalty, and emotional exhaustion all colliding in a space where no one was fully satisfied with the outcome. And when that kind of pressure continues for years without resolution, it does not stay quiet forever. It eventually changes shape. As Sumit and Jenny's story moved forward, the gap between what viewers saw and what they reportedly lived through kept widening. On screen, moments were often reduced to arguments that lasted a few minutes, followed by emotional resolution or temporary calm. But according to individuals familiar with long-term filming conditions, those short scenes were only fragments of much longer emotional cycles. Hours of tension, silence, frustration, and repeated conversations that rarely reached a real conclusion. Over time, that cycle created something heavier than conflict. It created emotional fatigue on both sides. Jenny, in particular, became a central focus of that fatigue. Her adjustment to life in India was never just about language or environment. It was about identity, belonging, and daily emotional survival inside a household where she reportedly felt like an outsider for an extended period. While the show often framed her experience as adapting to a new culture, those around the situation describe it as a much more personal struggle, one where she was constantly trying to find her place in a structure that never fully opened the door for her. And that is where the emotional tension begins to deepen. Because when someone feels like they are always being evaluated instead of accepted, every interaction becomes loaded with meaning. A simple silence can feel like rejection. A small disagreement can feel like exclusion. And over time, that perception builds into something more permanent, a belief that no matter what changes externally, the internal position remains the same. That belief, if left unresolved, often becomes the foundation for long-term emotional conflict. At the same time, Sumit was dealing with a different kind of pressure. His position was not simple. He was not only a partner in a relationship but also a son within a traditional household structure where expectations carry significant weight. In many families with strong cultural traditions, especially in closely connected households, individual choices are rarely isolated. They are connected to family reputation, future stability, and social perception. That context matters, because it explains why decisions that may seem straightforward from the outside are often far more complicated in practice. According to those familiar with the dynamic, Sumit often found himself in the middle of conflicting emotional demands. On one side, a partner who wanted stability, inclusion, and clarity. On the other, a family that expected alignment, respect for tradition, and gradual acceptance rather than rapid change. And in the middle of that space, he was expected to satisfy both without fully disappointing either. That kind of position rarely produces resolution. It usually produces delay. And delay became a pattern. Viewers saw it as hesitation. Jenny experienced it as uncertainty. His family likely saw it as conflict management. But in reality, it functioned as a holding pattern that allowed tension to accumulate rather than resolve. Each unresolved conversation added another layer. Each avoided confrontation added another boundary that remained unclear. And each unclear boundary made future interactions more sensitive. Over time, those layers began to affect how every person in the household communicated. Tone became sharper. Silence became longer. Small disagreements carried more emotional weight than they should have. Even routine interactions started to feel structured around avoidance rather than connection. And when a household reaches that stage, even normal conversations start to feel like negotiations. This is where the story reportedly begins to shift in a more serious direction. Because according to sources close to the broader situation, Jenny's later statements were not just emotional reflections anymore. They began to take a more structured form, describing specific experiences, repeated patterns, and long-term emotional impact. While these accounts remain unverified and should be understood as allegations, the shift in tone is what drew attention from those following the situation closely. It was no longer just frustration expressed in interviews or filmed moments. It was a consistent narrative forming across time. And that consistency is what reportedly triggered concern within Sumit's side of the family. From their perspective, the story being told publicly was no longer just about relationship struggles. It was becoming something that could influence how they were perceived outside their private environment. In traditional communities, reputation carries real consequences. It affects social standing, future opportunities, and even internal family relationships. So when personal disputes become public narratives, the stakes increase significantly. This is where reports of legal consultation begin to surface. Not as an immediate reaction, but as a response to escalation over time. According to individuals familiar with the matter, Sumit has been advised to take the allegations seriously, not only emotionally but structurally. Because once statements move from private disagreement into public accusation, especially ones involving treatment within a household, they enter a different category of concern. They are no longer just relationship issues. They become matters that can attract legal interpretation, public scrutiny, and long-term reputational consequences. And that changes everything. For years, the relationship between Sumit and Jenny operated in a space where problems were discussed privately or partially addressed on camera. But legal involvement, or even the consideration of it, introduces a completely different framework. It removes the flexibility of emotional negotiation and replaces it with formal process, documentation, and external evaluation. That shift alone signals that the situation has moved beyond the patterns viewers were used to seeing. At the same time, it is important to understand that legal consultation does not automatically confirm wrongdoing or guilt. In many cases, it is a protective step taken when public narratives begin to grow in intensity or when reputational risk increases. It can be about clarification, correction, or simply understanding how public statements may be interpreted under law. But regardless of intent, the perception of legal action itself is powerful. It signals escalation. And escalation is exactly what this relationship has been trying to avoid for years. Because every major turning point in their story has come from escalation, followed by temporary calm, and then another rise in tension. It is a repeating cycle that has defined their time together both on and off screen. What makes the current moment different is that the stakes appear to have moved beyond personal emotion. They now involve public narrative, cultural perception, and long-term consequences that cannot be easily reversed. And that is where we pause this part of the story. Because the next layer is not just about what was said, but about how those statements allegedly began to impact the people around them, and why the situation reportedly reached a point where silence was no longer an option on either side. Because once silence stops being an option, everything starts moving faster than people expect. According to sources familiar with the situation, the period after Jenny's more recent statements was not calm at all behind the scenes. While public viewers only saw occasional updates and fragmented narratives through interviews or online discussions, what was happening privately was a steady buildup of concern, frustration, and urgency on both sides. On Jenny's side, the stance reportedly became more firm. Instead of emotional reflection or mixed feelings about the past, the tone shifted toward clarity. She was no longer only describing what she felt in the moment. She was framing her experience as a consistent pattern over time. And that shift matters, because when a personal story becomes structured and consistent, it gains a different kind of weight in public and legal perception. For Sumit, this created a very different kind of pressure. Not just emotional pressure, but reputational pressure. People close to the situation say that the concern was not only about how he personally appeared, but how his entire family was being represented in the public narrative. In tightly connected households, especially those with strong cultural traditions, family reputation is not separate from individual identity. They are linked. So when one part of the story becomes controversial, it affects everyone connected to it. And that is where the situation reportedly began to shift from emotional response to formal consideration. Sumit is said to have moved from reacting privately to seeking structured advice on how to handle what was being said publicly. Not as an immediate confrontation, but as a way to understand the possible implications if the claims continued to circulate and intensify. Because once a narrative gains traction outside private circles, it no longer belongs to the people involved. It begins to exist independently, shaped by audience interpretation, media framing, and online repetition. And that is exactly what makes reality television conflicts so complicated. What starts as personal struggle often becomes public property. In earlier stages of their relationship, disputes between Jenny and Sumit's family were mostly contained within filmed scenes. Even when emotions were high, there was still a boundary between what was private and what was shared. But over time, that boundary started to dissolve. Social media discussions, interviews, and fan interpretations began filling in the gaps between episodes. And once that happens, the narrative no longer depends only on what actually occurred. It depends on what people believe occurred. That belief system is powerful, and once it forms, it is difficult to reverse. According to individuals familiar with the broader context, this is one of the reasons the current situation feels more serious than earlier conflicts. Because this is not just about disagreement within a household anymore. It is about competing narratives that exist in public space, each with emotional supporters, critics, and long-term consequences. Jenny's perspective, as described in her statements over time, reflects a long journey of adaptation, struggle, and emotional isolation. She has repeatedly expressed feeling like an outsider, someone who had to constantly prove her place in a family structure that did not initially accept her presence. Over time, those feelings reportedly became more defined, less about momentary conflict and more about sustained experience. On the other side, Sumit's position is more complex than it often appears. While viewers sometimes interpret his actions as avoidance or indecision, people close to him describe a person trying to balance competing loyalties under constant pressure. In many traditional households, particularly those where family approval carries significant weight, decisions are rarely individual. They are collective. And when a partner outside that structure is introduced, the balance becomes fragile. That fragility is what defined much of their relationship. Every attempt at resolution seemed temporary. Every moment of peace seemed conditional. And every compromise created new expectations that had to be managed later. Over time, that cycle creates emotional exhaustion for everyone involved, not just the couple but the extended family as well. And when exhaustion becomes long-term, communication often breaks down. Not through a single argument, but through gradual withdrawal. People speak less. They explain less. They assume more. And assumptions, once they replace communication, often become the source of misunderstanding. This is why, according to those following the situation closely, the recent developments feel like a breaking point rather than a new conflict. Because this time, the response is not just emotional. It is procedural. Reports suggesting that Sumit is considering or has engaged legal guidance indicate a shift in how seriously the situation is being treated behind the scenes. Legal consultation in cases like this is not necessarily about immediate action. It is often about understanding boundaries, risks, and possible outcomes if public statements continue or escalate. But even that step changes perception, because it signals that private resolution may no longer be enough. And once a situation reaches that stage, it enters a different phase entirely. At the same time, it is important to understand what is not confirmed here. Much of this remains based on reports, interpretations, and circulating information. There has been no fully verified public statement detailing legal proceedings in a formal sense. What exists is a growing perception that the conflict has reached a level where legal advice is being considered as part of damage control or strategic response. Still, perception matters almost as much as reality in public narratives, especially in stories that have been unfolding for years in front of an audience, because viewers are not just watching events anymore. They are interpreting patterns. They are connecting past scenes to present claims. They are building a timeline in their minds that may not fully match reality but feels emotionally coherent to them. And that is where the risk of misunderstanding grows. In situations like this, once a narrative becomes emotionally locked in for the audience, it becomes difficult for any new development to completely change it. Every new update is filtered through previous beliefs. Every statement is compared to earlier scenes. And every action is assigned meaning based on history rather than context. That is why the current moment is so sensitive. Because it is not just about what is happening now. It is about everything that has already happened being reinterpreted through a new lens.